Before the war, he was every man, and he was invisible. He was the product of a decade of dust and desperation. A farmhand in Iowa trying to make a living off parched land, a factory worker in Detroit just grateful to have a job, a college student in Boston reading about a world on fire, or a soda jerk in a small-town drugstore, dreaming of a girl. His world was small, defined by the Great Depression. He listened to Glenn Miller on the radio and worried about his next paycheck, not about Hitler. Europe and Asia were distant, impossible places. Then, on December 7, 1941, that world shattered. In the weeks that followed, a simple, nondescript brown envelope from the U.S. government arrived at his door. It was from the Selective Service. It was not a request. It was an order. He had been drafted. He was no longer just a man. He was about to be remade, property of the U.S. Army. Government issue AG. The days that followed were a blur of compressed, poignant lasts. It was the last home-cooked Sunday dinner, the last dance with his sweetheart at the local USO, the last night sleeping in his own bed. The entire nation was suddenly in motion, a mass migration of its youth. The most common, heartbreaking, and unifying sight in America became the goodbye at the train or bus station. Young men, now looking alien and small in their ill-fitting new uniforms, leaned far out of train windows for one final, desperate kiss. Mothers and sweethearts waved from the platform, a sea of white handkerchiefs, trying to be brave, holding back tears until the train was out of sight. It was the end of their old world, a profoundly personal sacrifice that was happening in every town, on every street, all at once. The reality of basic training was a profound, systemic shock, a machine designed to break a man down and rebuild him as a soldier. Places like Camp Blanding in Florida or Fort Benning in Georgia became massive, sprawling, muddy factories for turning civilians into weapons. The individuality they had cherished was the first casualty. It was stripped away, starting with their hair, which was shaved to the scalp. Drill sergeants, with a relentless, barking fury, became their new gods, breaking them of their civilian habits. They learned to march until their feet bled, to crawl on their bellies under live machine gun fire, to disassemble and reassemble their M1 rifle in the dark, and to endure the military's relentless, soul-crushing hurry up and wait. They were no longer individuals. They were a unit, a serial number, miserable, homesick, and being forged into something they didn't yet recognize. For hundreds of thousands of GIs, the real war began in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. After months of waiting and training in the rain-soaked fields of England, they were packed into claustrophobic, pitching landing craft in the choppy English Channel. They were seasick, they were soaked, they were weighed down by 60 pounds of gear, and they were terrified. When the ramp of the Higgins boat dropped, it was a descent into pure, deafening, industrial chaos. They plunged into cold water over their heads as German machine guns, the MG-42s known as Hitler's buzzsaws, ripped the water and the men around them to shreds. It was not a battle of strategy. It was a brutal, personal, 30-second fight for the next inch of wet sand. A scramble for survival on a beach codenamed Omaha. The GI in Europe, the dog-faced soldier, learned that combat was not one heroic charge. It was 90% misery and 10% pure terror. After D-Day, it was the savage, close quarters fighting in the impassable bocage hedgerows of Normandy, a maze of ancient earth walls where every field was an ambush. Later, it was the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, where men in summer-issue uniforms tried not to freeze to death in their own foxholes near Bastogne, their feet turning black with trench foot. Their life was defined by the cold, the mud, the rain, and the metallic, chemical taste of K-rations eaten in a ditch. They dreamed of hot food and dry socks with a passion they had once reserved for women and cars. This was the long slog, a war of attrition, one ruined town at a time. The GI in the Pacific, typically a U.S. Marine, fought a different war entirely. It was not a war of cities and civilization. It was a war of jungle, disease, and volcanic ash. This was a war of racial hatred, a war of no quarter against a fanatical enemy who refused to surrender, who saw capture as a fate worse than death. The GI fought in a green hell, a world of suffocating, 110-degree heat, of malaria, dysentery, leeches, and unseen snipers tied into the canopy. The island-hopping campaign Guadalcanal, Sapin. Peleliu was a series of brutal, frontal assaults against an enemy that was dug into interlocking, fortified pillboxes, caves, and tunnels. The objective was not to take the island, it was to cleanse it, one flamethrower burst at a time. As the GIs got closer to the Japanese home islands, the fighting reached a crescendo of unparalleled savagery. Iwo Jima was a hellscape, a barren island of black volcanic ash, a fortress of 20,000 Japanese soldiers dug into 16 miles of interlocking underground tunnels. They fought to the last man. Okinawa was even worse. It was a 90-day battle of pure attrition in a sea of mud and rain, with the first mass use of kamikaze attacks on the fleet offshore, and the tragic involvement of a civilian population. This was hell on earth, a vision of what the invasion of Japan itself would be. The GIs who survived were pushed to the absolute, breaking limit of human endurance, and the 1,000-yard stare, the hollow, haunted, empty look of a man who has seen the abyss became a common sight. The GI's home was not a barracks, it was a hole in the ground, a foxhole. It was his entire universe, a grave he dug for himself every night. It was his bedroom, his kitchen, and his fortress, often shared with one or two other men in a space of claustrophobic intimacy. This was where the war was actually lived, measured not in grand strategy by generals, but in the 100 yards of mud or jungle directly in front of you. It was a place of miserable cold or suffocating heat, where men would talk quietly about their dream meal back home, or trade their last cigarette, or simply sit in terrified silence, listening for the telltale thwump of an incoming mortar shell. In this world of absolute, random chaos, the GI's loyalty was not to the flag or to apple pie, or even to General Eisenhower. His loyalty was primal. It was to the man next to him. The bond forged in a foxhole, under artillery fire, was a covenant stronger than blood. You didn't fight for your country. You fought to protect your buddy. You ran into machine gun fire, not because you were brave, but because your friend was hit and you couldn't leave him. This brotherhood was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that mattered. It was the reason men were able to do the impossible, and it was the reason so many, for the rest of their lives, were haunted by a crushing survivor's guilt. There were no superheroes. Every GI was afraid all the time. It was a constant, physical presence, a cold knot in the stomach and a metallic taste in the mouth. They were afraid of artillery, the incoming mail that shrieked from the sky and killed at random, with no skill involved. They were afraid of snipers, of the bouncing Betty mine, of the German 88mm cannon, which could kill you from miles away. They were afraid of the dark and afraid of the light. Bravery wasn't about being fearless. It was about being able to function while paralyzed by fear. Many men developed the shakes, an uncontrollable tremor that no amount of willpower could stop. This was combat fatigue, the 1,000-yard stare, the look of a mind that had simply seen too much and had checked out. The GI's only lifeline to sanity, his only proof that the real world still existed, was mail. He lived for mail call, letters from home, known as V-mail, photographically reduced to save space, were his most precious possession. He would read his letters from his mother or his girl until the creases fell apart. In turn, he wrote back, and in doing so, he became a liar, a censor. He lied to protect them. He would write the food is okay while eating a cold, greasy K-ration in the mud. He would write don't worry, I'm safe just minutes after his entire platoon had been shelled. These letters were a desperate attempt to protect the ones he loved from the hell he was living, creating a profound, isolating gulf between his reality and theirs. When the war in Europe finally ended, the GI's role changed. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was a liberator, and it was here that he finally, truly, and horrifically understood why he had been fighting. As GIs advanced into Germany, they stumbled upon the concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. They were hardened combat veterans, men who had seen their friends blown apart. But nothing could have prepared them for this. They saw the walking skeletons, the piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, the gas chambers, the ovens. They smelled the smell. This was not war. This was an industrial factory for death. This was the pure, unadulterated evil they had been fighting. And the memory of what they saw would justify their sacrifice for the rest of their lives. It was over. The shooting had stopped. For the GIs in Europe and the Pacific, the long, slow, bureaucratic journey home began. It was a process managed by the Adjusted Service Rating Score, a points system that was the talk of every man. You got points for days in service, points for days in combat, points for wounds and medals, points for children back home. The men with the most points, the veterans who had seen the worst, went first. They were packed by the thousands onto massive troop ships like the Queen Mary, but this time, the mood was not one of fear, but of giddy, ecstatic, and impatient joy. They gambled, they talked, they ate, and they stared at the ocean, waiting. As the ships finally pulled into New York Harbor and they saw the skyline, and then the Statue of Liberty, a single, deafening roar would erupt from thousands of men at once. They had done it. They had survived. They were home. The ordinary men who returned were treated to an extraordinary promise. The generation that had returned from World War I had been forgotten, left to sell apples on the street during the Depression. This time, America made a different, revolutionary choice. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GI Bill, was a masterpiece of foresight. It promised them low-interest mortgages for new homes and, most importantly, it offered to pay for their college or vocational school education. The same men who had been crawling through mud were now sitting in lecture halls at Harvard and state universities. They didn't just rebuild their old lives, they built a new educated, prosperous middle class, and with it, the American suburbs, the baby boom, and the future. They won the war. They built the greatest generation. They created the modern world. But it all came at a profound, silent cost. These ordinary men came home with extraordinary, invisible wounds. There was no name for post-traumatic stress disorder, no therapy, no understanding. They were just shell-shocked or war-weary. They were told by a nation that wanted to move on to be a man to get over it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, hit the like button and subscribe for more daily content.